After his wealthy wife's funeral, Richard and his mistress Chloe eagerly await their fortune until a mysterious heir appears. What follows is a web of deception, hidden pasts, and a twisted game orchestrated from beyond the grave. The grand funeral had the air of a spectacle. Black-clad mourners filled the church, their faces wearing masks of grief, but beneath the surface, there was a different energy. The wealthy, powerful, and envious had all come to pay their final respects to Evelyn Mercer, a woman who had commanded attention in life just as she did in death. Her generosity was legendary, her social circle wide, and her name was on the lips of everyone in the city's upper crust. She had built an empire with her keen intellect, a legacy that left people in awe, even as they whispered behind her back. Her casket, made of polished mahogany, gleamed under the dim lights of the cathedral. The air was thick with the scent of lilies, too overpowering, as though masking something sour just beneath the surface. Her husband, Richard Mercer, sat in the front row, his head bowed, hands clasped together, the picture of a heartbroken widower. His finely tailored suit clung to his tall frame, and the stray tear he wiped away at just the right moment had not gone unnoticed by those watching. Every move seemed rehearsed, yet who would dare question the grief of a man who had just lost the love of his life? Beside him sat a woman in her 30s, her face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. She was striking, with soft, golden curls cascading down her shoulders, her eyes darting around the room. Her name was Chloe. The Mistress. She didn't belong here, among these people, in this place. But she had wanted to see the spectacle, the closing act of Evelyn Mercer's life, even though she could never admit it aloud. Richard squeezed her hand under the veil of his coat when no one was looking, a secret gesture between them, subtle but telling. She responded with a slight curl of her lips, a hidden smile that only he could see. As the service droned on, Richard's mind drifted. He should have been consumed with the weight of his wife's passing, but all he could think about was the future, the freedom that awaited him, the life he would soon live. For years, he had been trapped in a gilded cage, playing the role of the dutiful husband, all while his desires lay elsewhere. Evelyn had been sharp, suspicious even, but she had never quite caught on. Or so he thought. Once, they had shared love, a deep, abiding partnership, but somewhere along the line, that love had turned cold, more like a business arrangement. He had grown restless, yearning for something more, someone more vibrant, more alive. He had found it in Chloe. The contrast between his wife and his mistress was stark. Evelyn had been formidable, commanding, a woman who never accepted weakness. Chloe, on the other hand, was warm, spontaneous, her youth and beauty an intoxicating escape. After what felt like an eternity, the priest finally spoke the last rites. Mourners began to rise, giving Richard their condolences, each word sliding off him like raindrops on glass. He accepted the hugs, the whispers of sympathy, and the firm handshakes with practiced grace, but his mind was elsewhere. His eyes met Chloe's briefly, and they both knew what came next. Hours later, after the crowd had dispersed and the church stood almost empty, Richard found Chloe waiting for him outside by the car. She stood beneath a tree, her face half hidden in the shadow of her hat. Her posture was tense, though she tried to appear composed. The two exchanged a look, and Richard gave a slight nod to his driver to leave them alone. "I thought this day would never end," Chloe said quietly, her voice edged with nerves. She had been to plenty of funerals in her life, but this one felt different. The weight of Evelyn's presence, even in death, seemed to loom over them. Richard exhaled sharply, glancing back at the church, before turning his gaze on her. "It's over now. We just have to get through the reading of the will tomorrow, and then, we'll be free." "Completely." Chloe blinked, her blue eyes narrowing slightly. "You're sure about the will?" He hesitated for a fraction of a second, but then forced a smile. "It'll be fine." Evelyn left everything to me. You don't have to worry. But Chloe wasn't entirely convinced. She had heard too many stories of wealthy widows leaving unexpected surprises behind. She was a smart woman, Richard. What if she didn't, he cut her off, his voice firmer now. She loved me. Whatever problems we had, we were still married. Legally, I'm her husband. There's no reason to think she'd do anything different. Chloe looked at him, her expression softening. She had taken a gamble on this affair, risking more than just her reputation. The years they had spent together in secret had been intoxicating, but now that the stakes were higher, the fear gnawed at her. But she wanted to believe him, needed to believe him. Tomorrow, he said, stepping closer, lowering his voice as though the trees might hear him, we'll go to the lawyer's office, sit through the formalities, and after that, the inheritance will be ours. All of it. You'll finally have everything I promised. Chloe studied him, the lines of his face tight, his eyes dark. She had come this far, waiting patiently for the day when they could be together in the open, without sneaking around. But part of her still felt uneasy, like there was something she wasn't seeing. What if? What if there's something we don't expect? Richard placed his hands on her shoulders, his grip firm, almost reassuring. There won't be. Evelyn and we were complicated, but I know how she thought. I was her husband, after all. Trust me. Chloe bit her lip, then nodded. Okay. Tomorrow, then. He leaned in and kissed her, brief and secretive, before stepping back. Tomorrow. As they parted ways, Richard watched her disappear down the path, her silhouette fading into the twilight. He ran a hand through his hair, the weight of his lies pressing harder than ever. He had promised her freedom, wealth, and a new life, but in the pit of his stomach, something twisted. Evelyn had always been unpredictable, always one step ahead. But she was gone now, and tomorrow, everything would be his. The lawyer's office was cold and impersonal, its walls lined with shelves filled with thick law books that seemed untouched. Richard Mercer sat at the heavy mahogany table, his fingers tapping a steady rhythm on the polished wood. He wore the mask of a grieving widower, his face carefully composed, but inside, his mind raced. The reading of Evelyn's will would be the final formality in a drawn-out performance, a way to tie up the loose ends of their life together. After this, everything would change. Chloe sat beside him, her posture tense, a stark contrast to the calm demeanor she had tried to maintain throughout the day. Her hands rested in her lap, twisting nervously. She had dressed the part for this solemn occasion, a sleek black dress and low heels, understated jewelry that gave her an air of elegance. But beneath that polished exterior, she felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her. There had been a quiet dread gnawing at her ever since the funeral, but Richard had assured her that everything was under control. They were both waiting, pretending patience. The lawyer, an older man named Mr. Dunbar, finally entered the room, clutching a thin folder that seemed too insignificant to contain the entire future of Evelyn Mercer's fortune. He gave Richard a brief nod of sympathy, his expression somber. "I'm sorry for your loss," Mr. Dunbar said as he took a seat across from them. "I know this is a difficult time, but I hope that what's in this document brings you some peace and clarity." Richard gave a tight smile, though his mind was far from peaceful. He wanted this over with. Chloe, sitting to his right, didn't return the lawyer's words, her eyes fixed on the folder as though she could see through it to what lay inside. Mr. Dunbar opened the file with deliberate slowness, adjusting his glasses as he skimmed the top of the page. "Before we begin, I want to clarify that this is the final will and testament of Evelyn Mercer, duly signed and witnessed. There have been no updates or changes to this document since its creation. Richard leaned forward slightly, feeling the familiar twinge of anticipation. He had expected no changes. Evelyn had always been traditional, and she believed in the old ways of doing things, including leaving her wealth to her husband. There would be no surprises here, no hidden traps. Or so he thought. Mr. Dunbar began reading aloud. The standard legal preamble washed over Richard as he tried to keep his face neutral. But then, the lawyer's voice took a turn, and Richard's heart skipped a beat. To my husband, Richard Mercer, I leave the estate and a trust fund, valued at $5 million, with the provision that he uses it wisely, in remembrance of the life we built together. But this is not the entirety of my estate, and I ask that he respects the wishes outlined for the remainder of my assets. The remainder? Richard's hands clenched under the table. This wasn't supposed to happen. There was supposed to be no remainder, he was supposed to get everything. He forced himself to breathe, keeping his face impassive as the lawyer continued. The remainder of my assets, including properties, investments, and my shares in Mercer Industries, are to be left to. Mr. Dunbar paused, squinting at the document as if uncertain of what he was about to say. To an individual named Anthony Caldwell. The name fell into the room like a stone dropped into a still pond. For a moment, no one moved. The words hung in the air, incomprehensible, like a bad joke that no one understood. Who? Richard's voice was sharp, almost a hiss. Mr. Dunbar cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses again. Anthony Caldwell, he repeated. I have his contact information on file. He was specifically named in Mrs. Mercer's will as the beneficiary for the majority of her assets. Chloe glanced at Richard, her eyes wide with confusion. Who is he? She whispered, her voice barely audible. She knew everyone in Richard's life, everyone who could possibly be connected to Evelyn, and this name, this Anthony Caldwell, was not familiar. Richard's mind reeled. Who the hell was Anthony Caldwell? Evelyn had never mentioned this name, not once in their years together. His pulse raced as he struggled to grasp the implications. He'd expected to walk out of this office with everything under his control, the fortune that Evelyn had built, and the power that came with it. But now, some stranger was set to inherit the bulk of her wealth. There must be some mistake, Richard said, his voice rising. I've never heard of this person. Evelyn wouldn't do this. Mr. Dunbar remained calm, though his eyes flickered with sympathy. I assure you, Mr. Mercer, there is no mistake. This will was carefully drafted and signed by your wife. She specifically mentioned Mr. Caldwell by name. Richard's stomach twisted. He could feel Chloe beside him, her body rigid with shock. He had promised her everything, the wealth, the freedom, the future they'd both dreamed of. And now, this stranger had appeared from nowhere, snatching it all away in an instant. This. Anthony Caldwell, Chloe said, finding her voice at last. Who is he? What's his connection to Evelyn? Mr. Dunbar pursed his lips. I'm afraid I don't have that information, Ms. Davenport. He paused, acknowledging her with a nod. All I know is that your wife included him in her will as a key beneficiary. The rest of the details, I'm afraid, are private. Richard shot up from his seat, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. Private? He snarled, his calm facade cracking. This is my wife's will. I deserve to know who this man is, and why he's taking what should be mine. Mr. Dunbar remained steady in the face of Richard's outburst. Mr. Mercer, I understand this is unexpected. But the terms of the will are clear. Mr. Caldwell will be contacted and informed of his inheritance. If you have further questions, I suggest speaking to him directly. Richard stood there, his chest heaving, his mind spinning in 1,000 directions. His future, the one he had so meticulously planned, was unraveling before his eyes. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. Chloe rose slowly, touching his arm gently, though her own hand trembled. "We'll figure this out," she murmured, though her voice lacked conviction. We'll find out who he is." Richard didn't respond. His mind was already racing, searching for answers. Whoever Anthony Caldwell was, he had just made himself the enemy. And Richard wasn't about to let him take what belonged to him. Richard paced the study, the faint sound of traffic humming outside the window as dusk crept in. The grand house felt hollow now, each room too vast, too quiet without Evelyn. He stared at his phone, waiting for the private investigator to call back, though he already knew the answers wouldn't come easily. Anthony Caldwell. The name echoed in his head like a bad dream he couldn't wake from. Who the hell was this man? How had Evelyn known him? And why had she given him almost everything? The wineglass in his hand trembled slightly as he brought it to his lips. He wasn't a man who lost control easily, but this? This made no sense. Evelyn had been meticulous about her money, her estate, her image. She planned everything with the precision of a surgeon, and yet, she'd kept this from him. A stranger now held the keys to everything she had built. He turned as Chloe entered the room, her heels tapping softly against the marble floor. She was quieter than usual, her face drawn, pale in the soft light. She hadn't said much since the reading of the will, and he didn't blame her. It was as if they were standing on the edge of a cliff, peering into the unknown, neither one sure what would happen if they took the next step. "Did you find anything out?" she asked, her voice low. She stopped at the doorway, almost afraid to come closer. "Not yet." Richard set the glass down harder than he meant to, the sound sharp in the stillness. The investigator's digging, but so far, Anthony Caldwell might as well be a ghost. No obvious connections, no business ties. It's like he appeared out of nowhere. Chloe's brow furrowed as she wrapped her arms around herself. What if he's not who we think? What if Evelyn was hiding more than just him? Richard turned toward her, eyes narrowing. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, biting her lower lip. "I don't know. It's just. Evelyn wasn't stupid. She had to have known about us, at least on some level. What if she was planning this for longer than we think?" The thought twisted in Richard's chest like a knife. It was a possibility that had been lurking in the back of his mind, but he hadn't wanted to confront it. He'd thought Evelyn had been blissfully ignorant, or at least indifferent, to his affair. They had lived like business partners more than lovers in those last years, barely crossing paths in their sprawling home. But now, as the pieces shifted, he wondered if she had known far more than he'd given her credit for. Suddenly, it wasn't just Anthony Caldwell that haunted him. It was Evelyn herself. Even from beyond the grave, it felt as though she was still pulling the strings. It had been over a year ago when he first felt her suspicion, though she'd never said a word. He remembered the night clearly, the way she'd watched him from across the dinner table, her gaze too sharp, too knowing. They hadn't spoken much that evening, her questions casual, but each one had seemed to probe deeper than the last. "How was your day?" she'd asked, swirling the wine in her glass, her tone too smooth. "Fine," he'd replied, setting down his fork. "The usual meetings. Nothing exciting." Evelyn had smiled, but it hadn't reached her eyes. "You've been working late a lot." His hand had twitched, betraying him for just a second. "There's a new project. You know how it is." She'd nodded, but the silence that followed had felt heavier than usual. It wasn't until later that night, when he was in the shower, that he found a slip of paper tucked into his jacket pocket. A phone number. No name. Just numbers scribbled in her neat, careful handwriting. For weeks after, he'd been paranoid, careful to delete messages, wipe his tracks, but Evelyn never confronted him. Instead, she'd grown colder, her eyes more distant, and Richard had convinced himself that maybe she simply didn't care. That she'd already checked out of their marriage, focusing on her charity work, her investments, her public image. But now, with Anthony Caldwell's name hanging over him like a storm cloud, he couldn't shake the feeling that she had been watching, planning. Every move, every step he took, had it all been a part of some invisible game? And now, she was winning. Chloe sank into the leather armchair, her hands trembling slightly as she poured herself a drink. Richard, what if she knew everything? She met his eyes, the fear palpable between them. What if she was watching us the whole time? Richard clenched his jaw, refusing to let the fear show. If she knew, she wouldn't have waited this long to do something. She would have confronted me. Or she was waiting for the right moment, Chloe shot back, her voice unsteady. She was always calculated. Always one step ahead. The truth of her words hit him harder than he wanted to admit. Evelyn had never been impulsive. She'd never made a move without thinking through every consequence. But if she had known, then what was her end game? Why leave it all to this stranger instead of humiliating him in life? Chloe stood abruptly, pacing the room. This doesn't feel right. I don't feel right. It's like someone's watching us. Richard frowned. What are you talking about? I don't know. She rubbed her arms as if trying to ward off a chill. Ever since the funeral, I've had this feeling. Like she's still here, pulling the strings, even now. That's ridiculous, Richard snapped, though he felt it too, the growing weight of Evelyn's presence in every corner of their lives. But Chloe wasn't convinced. She stopped in front of the fireplace, staring into the unlit hearth. You don't think she planned all of this? The will, this Anthony Caldwell, us? Richard didn't have an answer. His mind raced, trying to untangle the web Evelyn had left behind, but the deeper he thought, the more tangled it became. What if this wasn't just about revenge? What if there was something bigger at play, something Evelyn had kept buried beneath her calm exterior? As the silence thickened between them, Richard's phone buzzed on the desk. He snatched it up, hoping for the investigator's call, some piece of information that would make sense of this mess. But it wasn't the investigator. It was a message from an unknown number. Short, simple. I know everything. Richard stared at the screen, his blood running cold. It arrived the next morning, as if Evelyn herself had reached out from the grave. The letter, sealed with the unmistakable M crest in crimson wax, lay on the marble foyer table like a relic from another era. Richard stood frozen as the housekeeper handed it to him, her eyes wide with curiosity. He dismissed her quickly, his mind reeling. No one had used that seal in years. Evelyn had insisted on it for important documents, contracts, and personal letters in the early days of their marriage, but the tradition had fallen away as their relationship deteriorated. To see it now, after her death, made his stomach twist. He turned the letter over in his hands, the weight of it unsettling. His name was written in her unmistakable, elegant script, Richard Mercer. No husband, no terms of endearment. Just his name, stark and formal. He took a breath, steeling himself, then broke the seal with a deliberate snap. The paper was thick, her scent faint but still there, like a lingering ghost. His eyes scanned the first line, his pulse quickening. Richard, if you're reading this, you've already realized I knew more than you ever imagined. His grip tightened. You've built your life on lies and shadows, and I've watched you dance through both with careless ease. But every action has a consequence, and yours, my darling, have finally caught up with you. I knew about Chloe. I knew about all the others before her. But this letter isn't about your infidelities, that would be too simple. It's about what comes next. You've always been predictable, Richard, but this time you'll have to think carefully if you want to survive. Survive. The word hung in the air, sending a chill down his spine. The letter continued, each word laced with icy precision. There is more to my will than you've been told, more than even Anthony Caldwell knows. I've left clues, breadcrumbs that will lead you to the real prize. But don't think for a moment that I'll make this easy for you. If you want to inherit what I've hidden, you'll have to prove something to me first, that you can be the man you pretended to be all these years. Every step will be a test. And trust me, Richard, I'm still watching. His hands trembled as he reached the final lines. You'll know when it begins. I've made sure of that. The first test is already in play. There was no signature. Just the eerie emptiness of a page that had said too much and not enough. Chloe found him in the study an hour later, staring blankly at the letter on the desk. She had sensed the shift in the house, like a storm gathering just beyond the horizon, and now that storm seemed to be crackling in the very air around Richard. What is it? She asked, her voice small, uncertain. What did the letter say? Richard didn't respond at first. He looked up at her, his expression unreadable, and slid the letter across the desk. As she read, her face drained of color. She knew, Chloe whispered, her voice barely audible. Her fingers clutched the edge of the letter as if it might disappear. She knew about us. Richard stood abruptly, pushing the chair back with force. Of course she knew. Evelyn always knew more than she let on. But this? He gestured toward the letter with a frustrated snarl. This is something else. She's playing games from beyond the grave, setting up some ridiculous test. As if this is all a puzzle for me to solve. Chloe's hands shook as she set the letter down. What does she mean by survive? What kind of test is she talking about? Richard didn't answer. He turned toward the window, staring out at the manicured lawn, his thoughts racing. What had Evelyn set in motion? And why the cryptic warnings? His first instinct was to dismiss it as another one of her cruel tricks, but the letter had struck a nerve. She had planned this, down to the last detail. Evelyn had never been a woman who left things to chance. You don't think she's left something dangerous, do you? Chloe's voice wavered. What if this isn't just about money? What if she... Stop it, Richard snapped, cutting her off. You're letting your paranoia get the better of you. But Chloe couldn't stop the growing fear. Ever since that message from the unknown number, the one that said, I know everything, she had been on edge. She felt Evelyn's presence like a shadow in every room, watching, waiting. And now this letter, it was more than she could handle. It was too much. She's not here, Richard said, as if reading her thoughts. She's dead, Chloe. Whatever this is, it's just her trying to mess with us one last time. But Chloe wasn't convinced. She paced the room, her mind spiraling, thoughts darting from one possibility to the next. What if it's not just a game? What if she really is, watching? Richard slammed his fist down on the desk, silencing her. Enough. I won't let her control us from the grave. Do you understand? Chloe flinched, her eyes wide. She had never seen him like this, not with this edge of desperation. It was as if Evelyn had reached into his very soul and twisted it. Okay, she whispered, her voice barely audible. But what are you going to do? Are you going to play her game? Richard straightened, forcing himself to calm down. I'll find out what she's hidden. Whatever this test is, I'll pass it. And when it's over, the fortune will be mine. Ours. Chloe nodded, though a sliver of doubt crept into her mind. She wanted to believe him, but something about the letter, about the way Evelyn had always moved with silent purpose, made her think this was more than just a game. That night, as Richard scoured through old files, papers, anything that might reveal a clue, Chloe lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. Her thoughts were a jumble of fear and suspicion, and with every hour that passed, she felt it more, Evelyn's presence. It wasn't just paranoia anymore. It was something darker, more insidious. A whisper in the shadows. A reminder that Evelyn Mercer had never been a woman to cross lightly. And now, even in death, she was pulling the strings. Richard stared at the young man seated across from him, his fingers tightening around the arms of his chair. Anthony Caldwell, if that was even his real name, looked entirely too calm for someone claiming to be the illegitimate son of Evelyn Mercer. Richard's mind raced as he took in the man's appearance, sharp features, dark hair, and a cool, detached expression that Richard found both unnerving and infuriating. There was no trace of Evelyn in this stranger, no hint of the woman Richard had spent years alongside. And yet, the resemblance to someone in the distant past, nagged at him. He couldn't place it, but the familiarity unnerved him. Anthony met Richard's gaze with the confidence of someone who had nothing to lose. I know this is a shock to you, Mr. Mercer, he said smoothly. It was to me too, at first. But my mother. Evelyn, she planned this. She wanted me to have what I was owed. Richard's jaw clenched. What you were owed? The words tasted bitter in his mouth. I don't even know who you are. You expect me to believe that Evelyn, my wife, had a child and hid it from me for all these years? Why should I believe any of this? Anthony didn't flinch. He leaned forward slightly, his posture relaxed, almost casual. I understand your skepticism. But the truth is, Evelyn and I had been in contact for years. She reached out to me when I was in my 20s, told me who she was and why she had to keep me hidden. It was complicated, and I know it's hard to hear, but she was doing what she thought was best. She kept it quiet to protect her reputation, and yours. Richard's head spun. Evelyn, cold and calculating Evelyn, had an illegitimate child? It seemed impossible, absurd even. But as he watched Anthony speak, he couldn't shake the feeling that this young man believed every word he was saying. There was no hesitation in his voice, no faltering. If this was a con, it was a damn good one. Chloe, sitting beside Richard, had been silent since Anthony had introduced himself, her face pale and drawn. Now she shifted in her seat, the tension radiating from her. She could feel her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. If Anthony was who he claimed to be, her position beside Richard was in jeopardy. She had worked too hard, waited too long, to have everything slip through her fingers because of this supposed son. How do we know you're telling the truth? Chloe's voice cut through the room, sharper than she intended. She crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing at Anthony. Anyone can come in here with a story. Where's the proof? Anthony's gaze flicked to Chloe briefly, dismissive, before settling back on Richard. I understand you need proof. I've got the birth certificate, letters from Evelyn, DNA tests, everything you need to verify my identity. I wouldn't be sitting here otherwise." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Richard stared at him, disbelieving, as Anthony pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. His hands itched to tear it open, but he hesitated. He wasn't sure what scared him more, that this man was lying or that he was telling the truth. Chloe leaned forward, her breath quickening as the tension built between them. She had no doubt that the contents of that folder would change everything. If Anthony really was Evelyn's son, it would mean Richard had been playing a far more foolish game than he'd ever realized. Evelyn, the puppet master, had kept secrets deeper and darker than anyone had suspected. "You can read it now, or take your time," Anthony said casually. "But sooner or later, you'll have to accept the truth. Evelyn didn't leave you the empire she built. She left it to me, her son." Richard's blood boiled at the arrogance in his tone. This stranger had walked into his life, sat in his house, and claimed what was rightfully his. He pushed back from the table abruptly, pacing toward the window, trying to clear the fog of anger and confusion clouding his mind. Evelyn had planned this. She had known about the affair, had known about Chloe, and yet her real betrayal ran deeper. She had kept a son, a secret child, hidden from him all these years, waiting until her death to unearth this devastating truth. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to steady his breathing. "Why didn't she tell me?" he demanded, his voice low but fierce. "Why wait until now? Why play this game?" Anthony shrugged, his expression unreadable. "Maybe she wanted to see what kind of man you really were. Maybe she wanted to see if you could handle the truth. Or maybe she just wanted to protect me until the right time." "That's a convenient story," Chloe snapped, her face flushed with anger. "You show up out of nowhere, claim to be her son, and expect us to just hand everything over to you? You're not the only one who's invested in this." Anthony's eyes narrowed slightly at Chloe, but he didn't respond to her. His focus was on Richard, and Richard alone. "I don't care if you believe me right now," Anthony said, his voice calm but firm. "The truth doesn't need your permission to exist. Evelyn made sure everything was in place. Whether you like it or not, I'm her heir." Richard turned slowly, the weight of those words sinking in. He didn't want to believe it. He didn't want to accept that everything he had planned for, the inheritance, the power, the life he'd envisioned with Chloe, was slipping through his fingers. But the way Anthony spoke, the certainty in his eyes, left Richard with little doubt that this was more than just a clever con. Evelyn had been orchestrating this for years. And now he was left standing in the ruins of her final move. Later that night, after Anthony had left with the promise of returning soon to settle matters legally, Chloe sat on the edge of the bed, staring blankly at the floor. The tension in the house was suffocating, like a noose tightening around her neck. "What are we going to do?" she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "He'll take everything." Richard stood at the window, his face a mask of barely controlled rage. "We'll fight this," he said, though the words felt hollow even to him. "There has to be a way." Chloe shook her head, her voice trembling. "What if there isn't? What if Evelyn has already won?" Richard didn't answer. He stared out into the darkness, feeling the weight of Evelyn's shadow pressing down on him. She had been clever, too clever. She had known exactly what she was doing, even from beyond the grave. Chloe stared at the message on her phone, her thumb hovering over the send button. The text was simple, * we need to meet. Alone * her heart raced, and her throat tightened as she imagined what could come next, but she pressed send anyway. There was no turning back now. It had been days since Anthony's visit, and the tension in the house had grown unbearable. Richard's fury simmered beneath the surface, barely contained by a thin veneer of control. He had been pacing the house like a caged animal, talking endlessly about lawyers, strategies, and proving Anthony was a fraud. But Chloe wasn't so sure. Every instinct told her that Anthony's story, as unbelievable as it sounded, held more truth than Richard was willing to admit. And if it was true, she had to act quickly. The life she had fought so hard to build was slipping through her fingers. Richard's paranoia was growing by the day, his plans more desperate. She couldn't afford to wait for him to figure it out, not when Anthony had become the real threat, and possibly her only way out. The message buzzed with a response within minutes. * tomorrow night. I'll send the details. The next morning, Richard sat at the kitchen table, staring at the stack of documents spread in front of him. He hadn't slept in days, his mind too busy untangling the threads of Evelyn's last move. Anthony's sudden appearance, the will, the letter, it was all too carefully crafted. Evelyn had always been a master manipulator, but this was beyond even her usual cruelty. She'd known about Chloe. About all of it. And now, she had set her bastard son loose to destroy everything Richard had built. The inheritance was slipping away, and with it, his control over Chloe, his life, his future. He couldn't let that happen. But confronting Anthony directly wouldn't work. Not yet. Richard needed leverage, something to break Anthony's claim, to destroy his credibility. He reached for his phone, the one contact that had always worked in times like these, a fixer who dealt in the gray areas of the law. It rang twice before a voice on the other end answered, rough, but familiar. Yeah. I need a favor, Richard said, his tone low, measured. Something discreet. The man chuckled. Aren't they always? That evening, Chloe met Anthony in a secluded corner of an upscale bar in the city. She had chosen the spot carefully, somewhere she and Richard would never be seen together, a place where no one knew her name. Anthony arrived just as she did, slipping into the booth with ease, as though he'd been expecting this conversation all along. I was wondering when you'd reach out, he said, his eyes dark and unreadable. There was a slight smirk on his lips, but it wasn't one of amusement. It was calculated, like everything about him. Chloe took a slow breath, steadying her nerves. She was in dangerous territory, but the stakes were too high to play it safe. Richard's unraveling, she said quietly, leaning in. He's already making plans, calling in favors to try to get rid of you. Anthony's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. And what do you want, Chloe? To warn me? Out of the kindness of your heart. She laughed, a brittle sound. Let's not pretend I'm here because of kindness. I'm here because I know Richard, and I know how desperate he's getting. He's not going to let this go, and he's dangerous when he feels cornered. And you're not? Anthony asked, raising an eyebrow. I'm practical, she replied, her voice sharper than she intended. I know how to adapt when things shift. You and I both know you have a strong claim to the inheritance. But Richard won't go down without a fight, and if you don't take him seriously, he'll drag you through the courts and ruin your life. Anthony studied her for a long moment, his fingers tracing the rim of his glass. And what's your angle in all this? You want me to take care of him for you? I want to be on the winning side, she said bluntly. If you're who you say you are, I have no future with Richard. He's going to lose. And when he does, I want to make sure I'm not left with nothing. Anthony's smirk returned, more genuine this time. So, you want to switch sides? Chloe nodded. We both get what we want. You get the fortune without having to worry about Richard, and I get a share of what's mine. He leaned back, considering her. And how do I know you won't double-cross me the way you're about to double-cross him? Her lips curved into a bitter smile. Because I'm betting on survival, and you're the better bet. I don't care about loyalty, I care about who's going to come out on top. Anthony's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer, then he raised his glass in a toast. To survival, then. Chloe clinked her glass against his, sealing the pact that would change everything. Meanwhile, back at the house, Richard's plan was already in motion. The fixer had agreed to handle things, quietly, of course. A background check on Anthony, anything that could discredit him, destroy his claim to the Mercer estate. And if nothing turned up? Well, there were other ways to make people disappear. Richard wasn't about to let Evelyn's ghost win, and he certainly wasn't going to let some illegitimate heir ruin everything he built. But as Richard paced his study, he couldn't shake the gnawing suspicion that Chloe was hiding something from him. She had been distant lately, quieter, more on edge. He had caught her whispering into her phone late at night, her excuses flimsy. His trust in her had never been deep, but now it was paper-thin. It was time to test her loyalty. As the days passed, the tension between Richard, Chloe, and Anthony grew tighter, each of them making moves in secret, all while pretending to maintain the fragile peace. Chloe met with Anthony again, solidifying their pact, while Richard followed his own dark path, waiting for the right moment to strike. The double crosses were inevitable. Chloe, slipping information to Anthony in exchange for promises of wealth and safety. Richard, watching Chloe more closely, suspecting her betrayal but unable to confront her without proof. And Anthony, playing them both, knowing that in the end, the fortune would be his. But none of them saw the storm coming. Not yet. Each thought they were the one pulling the strings, each convinced that they would come out on top. And Evelyn, in her grave, had already ensured that none of them would win. The room felt like a pressure cooker, heat rising between Richard, Chloe, and Anthony as they faced off in the drawing room. The air was thick with tension, secrets swirling just beneath the surface, ready to explode. Richard stood by the fireplace, jaw clenched, eyes locked on Anthony, who sat in a chair opposite, calm as ever. Chloe was perched nervously on the edge of the couch, her fingers twisting in her lap, glancing between the two men. It had all come to this. I don't know why you're still here, Richard snarled, pacing in tight circles. You think you've won, don't you? Walking in here with your papers and your stories, pretending to be something you're not. But it's not going to work. I've had investigators looking into you, and there's nothing. No real past, no connections. You're a fraud. Anthony raised an eyebrow, utterly unfazed. You're grasping at straws, Richard. Everything's been verified. The DNA tests are legitimate. The letters, the proof, it's all there. That's not enough. Richard's voice cracked as his composure slipped. You think I'm going to let some bastard walk in here and take everything I've built? You're nothing. Chloe flinched, the words hanging heavy in the room. But before anyone could respond, a new voice sliced through the air, cutting the tension with an unexpected sharpness. You're right about one thing, Richard. He's not who you think he is. All three of them turned to the doorway, where Evelyn's lawyer, Mr. Dunbar, stood with a thick envelope in hand, his expression unreadable. Richard's stomach dropped as the older man stepped forward, his presence ominous, carrying with him a weight of finality. What is this? Richard asked, dread pooling in his gut. Mr. Dunbar didn't answer right away. He walked into the room with the solemn air of someone about to deliver a death sentence. I've been instructed to deliver this to you, Richard. From Evelyn. It's her final word on all of this. Anthony's face remained calm, but a flicker of something, doubt, crossed his eyes. Chloe's hands trembled in her lap as Mr. Dunbar handed the envelope to Richard, the red wax seal unmistakable. Another letter from Evelyn. Richard stared at it, reluctant to break the seal. He was no longer sure what truth he wanted to face. Slowly, almost mechanically, he opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. Evelyn's familiar handwriting danced across the page, each word pulling him deeper into the trap he hadn't seen until it was too late. Richard. If you're reading this, you've passed the first part of the test. Congratulations on your endurance. But I suspect by now you're realizing that this is about much more than an inheritance. It's about who you are, ***. Anthony Caldwell isn't my son. He's not even real. Well, he's real enough, but I created him. Carefully. Every document, every piece of proof you've seen has been arranged by me, down to the last detail. I needed to know how far you would go. Would you fight for what you thought was yours? Would you destroy someone you believed to be my child? You were never fighting for the money, Richard. You were fighting to keep up the lie you've told yourself for years, that you were entitled to my wealth, my legacy. But it was never yours. And it never will be, ***. None of it was ever meant for you. You see, I've left everything to charity. All of it. The estate, the money, everything we built together, it's going to causes that matter. Causes that will do real good in the world. Not to you, not to Chloe, and certainly not to Anthony. You'll be left with nothing but what you came into this marriage with, your own name. And even that, I imagine, will feel like a burden after this, ***. Good luck, Richard. You'll need it, ***. The room went deathly quiet as Richard's face turned pale, the letter slipping from his hand. His world, the future he had clung to so tightly, the fortune he had schemed for, had vanished in an instant. Evelyn had taken everything from him, even from the grave. Anthony watched him carefully, but there was no gloating. His role in all of this was over, and he knew it. So, I was just a tool, he muttered, half to himself, half to the room. A pawn in her game. Chloe was the first to break the silence, her voice trembling with fear and desperation. It's all gone? All of it? She looked at Richard, her face stricken with panic. She had bet everything on this. Everything on him. Richard couldn't respond. His throat felt tight, his mind racing as he tried to grasp the full weight of what Evelyn had done. She had outplayed him. Completely. There would be no inheritance, no fortune, no future. Everything he had built, everything he had planned, had crumbled. Chloe's face twisted with rage, her eyes flashing as she turned on him. You promised me everything. You said it would be ours. You. Shut up. Richard snapped, his voice a snarl. But even as he yelled, the power in his words was hollow. He had nothing left to offer her. He had nothing left, period. Chloe backed away from him, her breath shallow and quick. She could see it now, how her life had unraveled at the hands of the dead woman she had never truly known. The truth was bitter, a knife turning in her gut. She had spent years waiting for this moment, thinking it would all be worth it in the end. And now? Now there was nothing. She turned toward the door, her footsteps quick and panicked, as though trying to outrun the inevitable. But no one followed her. Richard stood there for what felt like an eternity, the weight of Evelyn's final blow crushing him. She had always been 2 steps ahead, always seen more than she let on. And now, she had left him with nothing but the cold knowledge that he had been played from the start. The room felt emptier without Chloe. Without anyone. Richard turned slowly toward the window, staring out into the vast grounds of the estate he no longer owned. He could almost hear Evelyn's laughter, a soft, ghostly whisper on the wind. She had won. Completely and utterly. And in the end, that was all she had ever wanted.